Good. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is David Coates. I'm one of the co-organizers of this conference. I'd like to welcome you to the first of 4 sessions today, which will then culminate in the showing of Crossing Arizona this evening. I hope you find the day to your value, and I will ask my colleague Peter Ciavellis if he will formally begin this session. Welcome. It's good to see you all.
This morning's panel is entitled Immigration Flows in Time and Space. And our goal here is to compare previous waves of U.S. immigration with past migrations and other contemporary global population movements. We hope this morning to provide you the context with which to understand much of what's going to go on in this conference for the rest of the meetings. To do this, we're joined by 2 very distinguished panelists that are very much the top analysts in their fields. Mark Miller is the Emma Smith Morris Professor of Political Science and International Relations in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Delaware. Among his many publications, he is the co-author of the very widely cited The Age of Migration. Mark has flown all night from Italy to join us, so we're especially gratified to have him here this morning, and we're especially gratified that he made it, given the way airlines have been functioning lately. Michelle Wooker has not come so far, but we're equally delighted to have her here, and she's the author of the recently published Lockout: Why America Keeps Getting Immigration Wrong When Our Prosperity Depends on Getting It Right. She's a 2007 Guggenheim Fellow. She recently became the executive director of the World Policy Institute, where she has been a senior fellow since 2000. We want to extend a very warm welcome to you this morning, and welcome to Wake Forest. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Mark?
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here at the home of the Demon Deacons. It's really a pleasure. I greatly admire your university. Well, my job is to contextualize the subject matter of this conference, which is migration between the United States and Mexico. And I think I'm happy to announce that my co-author, Stephen Castles, and I have drafted the 4th edition of The Age of Migration. So you can consider my talk a sketch of the age of migration. I want to divide my brief comments into 2 parts. The first will concern kind of our claim. Why do we think that this current epoch should be called the age of migration? Because there's been many, many periods of mass migration in the history of humankind. I had a very tough Turkish senior thesis advisor at Madison, Wisconsin, by the name of Kamal Karpat, and he once told me that, Mr. Miller, rare is the historical epoch that is not importantly affected by international migration. So the first part will really be a sketch of the book, and then in the second part, I understand that Secretary of Labor Marshall did not go much into U.S.-Mexico immigration history, and I thought I'd quickly stretch that too. I promise not to run much over a half an hour, and if I have time, I have a list of what I think are the most important kind of comparative lines of inquiry to inform U.S.-Mexico public policy making. So let's get to work, Miller. Migration has always occurred, and I'll just mention a few of the major episodes that we perhaps can talk about at greater length later on. I always begin with my students with the end of the Western Roman Empire, which was a period of enormous mass migration, and most historians agree that one of the causes for the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, but not the only one, was in fact the vast Volkerwanderung, the people migrations, the tribal migrations from the Eurasian steppe. The vast Eurasian steppe, of course, will bring about vast migrations that affect the Indian Peninsula, China, the Middle East, and Europe for centuries and centuries. Most Europeans, of course, have an Asian genetic imprint. There's a few exceptions, like the Basques. Later on, the Vikings between the 8th and the 11th century, they are the great migratory people, and they greatly affect societies and politics from Russia to the Mediterranean to Normandy to England, Ireland. Dublin, of course, was a Viking city. MacLachlan is son of a Norseman. I could go on and on. The Crusades, the Inquisition, the mass expulsion of Jews and Muslims, to the decline of the Ottoman Empire with the vast killings and expulsion of Ottoman Muslims and Jews. But by the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, we're in the mercantile era. And a feature of governance during this period was that governments viewed their populations as an important resource to conserve. And most mercantilist states in the transatlantic area actively oppose the emigration of their populations. There's a number of recent good books on that, including a book by Nancy Green and Patrick Vey out of the University of Illinois, and of course a recent book by Aristide Zolberg features this theme as well. So in the 17th and 18th centuries, in the transatlantic space, governments like the British government were leery of letting their populations go. This, of course, was the era of the founding of the New World, and there was migration from England and Ireland and whatnot to what became the United States, Canada, and certain areas of Latin America like Argentina, Brazil, Australia, and New Zealand. But by and large, most people were too poor to afford international migration. This begins to change in the 19th century, and there's a confluence of factors that will lead to the first great migratory epoch, really the first era of globalization, which is driven by massive European migration to the New World. Roughly between 1830 and 1930, about 60 million Europeans come and people the United States, Canada, Australia, and those Latin American, South American states that I mentioned. So what changed for this to happen? First, I think we need to mention a new norm. The French Revolution gave us the norm that people, part of their human rights and democratic rights was the right to leave. Governments weren't very happy with that norm, and of course the French Revolution was beleaguered and attacked from without. But that was something that contributed to this change. And then there was the general process of industrialization, which of course occurs first and above all in England. This creates a middle class, this creates savings, this creates then a situation where people can finance trips across the Atlantic. A major factor would be the decline in the cost of transportation across the Atlantic. So during this period, the general pattern is of movement from labor-rich zones in Europe, where there's really a surplus of people, to labor-scarce areas of the New World: North America, South America, New Zealand, and Australia. And by and large, this was a very beneficial process because the migrants who moved increased their productivity. They earned more money. And this process then brings millions of people. Here in the United States, we made no secret about our desire to attract European migrants. This was a white European republic. We had a vision that all of the area from the East Coast to the West Coast belonged to us given to us by God, as it were. It was a messianic vision that has much to do with colonialism and imperialism, and of course usurped the rights of the Native Americans. But this process went on up until the interwar period. And then, to use the words of Roger Daniels, the golden door began to be closed. There was a reaction against immigration. Immigration is beneficial, but it also has uneven distributional, that's the fatigue setting in, effects. And we set up a select commission in 1907 to study those effects. The commission was influenced by racialist and eugenicist ideas, and the Dillingham Commission will make proposals to greatly reduce immigration. Those proposals are translated into bills. They're blocked by presidential vetoes, but finally in 1917, and after World War I, we get the Quota Acts, and that pretty much closes the door to immigration to the United States, and that has a great effect upon immigration to the entire New World. And we enter into the interwar period of autarky, which leads to the disaster of World War II following the disaster of World War I. So moving very quickly, after World War II, the door begins to open again. A pair of authors by the name of Hatton and Williamson, in a very important book called International Migration in the Global Economy, argue that 5 things precipitate what Castles and Miller call the age of migration. The first is the monumental shift first identified by the Argentinian scholars, the husband and wife Lattis and Lattis. Circa 1970, Latin America goes from a net importer of people to a net exporter of people. And today it remains a net exporter. And basically that's because Latin American growth does not keep up with North American and also European growth, so that you have net exportation of people largely to North America, but in recent years also to Southern Europe, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. So that's the first big shift. The second big shift is the virtual drying up of emigration from Northern, Western, and Southern Europe to North America and the New World. As late as 1965, our Congress, enlightened as it is, would reform our immigration law with the idea that post-1965 would be largely European. But of course, that was not the case. That was not the first and only miscalculation by our Congress. In fact, that's the pattern. The pattern is for miscalculation and unexpected outcomes, as we'll see, I think, in coming days. A third important point was the emergence of new zones of migration. It's only after 1965 that we get truly global migration, and even the involvement of Africans. Prior to, back during that first era of globalization, Africans largely did not participate in international migration. They may have moved internationally, but they stayed within the continent of Africa for the most part, and that was because of the poverty constraint. The fourth major change that occurs is the development of a major locus of migration in the Middle East. These are the Gulf states, the oil-rich Gulf states, which bring in millions and millions and millions of temporary foreign workers, particularly from India and Pakistan. A final point that Hatton and Williamson makes involves Eastern Europe. With the collapse of communist systems, you get a large out-migration. And so East Europeans flood into Western Europe and Southern Europe and North America and some other places as well. But be careful. I'm just back from Poland and the Ukraine, and though Poland is going through what we call migration transition. That is to say, it's being transformed very rapidly from a country characterized by emigration abroad to becoming an immigration land in its own right. So Cassels and Miller identify 6 general tendencies that define, as it were, the age of migration. The first is the globalization of migration. All areas of the world are greatly involved in international migration. The second is the increased volume of migration. We think, according to UN statistics, that there's roughly 200 million international migrants today. That's only 2 or 3% of the total world population. But most people around the world are now directly affected by international migration in one way or another. And this is something new. It's a global phenomenon affecting everybody, but we should be clear that international migration is not inexorable. It can be reduced, and it has been reduced in certain circumstances. The third feature is the increasing complexity of migration. Countries no longer are just guest worker receiving countries or lands of emigration. Most countries have multiple forms of migration. There's great complexity involved in migration policy, and that is different than what we think than what prevailed beforehand. Feminization of migration, well, there's always been women in migration, but now we have flows that are almost entirely made up of women, like female domestic workers in the Middle East. The fifth, and perhaps the most important characteristic of the age of migration, is the growing political saliency of migration. It seems everywhere around the world, domestic politics are roiled by migratory questions. Where migration is a huge issue in bilateral and multilateral relations. Last year, even the United Nations got involved in migration. And of course, we saw in the U.S.-Mexican context, President Bush and President Fox giving new significance to migration in U.S.-Mexico relations. I called this the U.S.-Mexico immigration honeymoon of 2001. In the new edition of the book, we're going to add a 6th defining feature, and this is the diffusion of migration transition. More and more lands are being transformed from lands of emigration into lands of immigration. And these countries would include Mexico. They would include Spain, Turkey, the Republic of Korea, Thailand. There's a list of about 50 such countries. Okay, so the U.S.-Mexico relation and the impasse that characterizes the relationship for the last 30 years, my entire professional career. Okay, I've been working on this area. I've been personally involved in it. It is actually very typical of the global situation. There's a global impasse on migration between the North and the South. Mexico and the United States happens to be the most significant relationship within that global question. Now, very quickly, it's very interesting to read the history books coming out today. Read Robert Kagan, the leading neoconservative historian, his new book on the history of U.S. Foreign policy up until this 1900. Look at the images of Mexico and how the Americans treat Mexico. We have a very bellicose attitude towards Mexico. I hate to say this, but it seems to be the reality. The new book by Zollberg also bears this out. There wasn't much Mexican migration to the United States until about 1900. But what we've learned recently is that even before the first Bracero program, which begins in 1917, there was very extensive contracting of Mexican workers to work in agriculture and in other jobs. Zollberg estimates there may have been up to 500,000 Mexicans in the United States prior to 1917. In the First World War, the Secretary of Labor waives the Foreign Act forbidding contract labor, and we begin to recruit Mexicans because of a perceived labor shortage due to the war. This is the first Bracero policy. It's very important for us to understand that the U.S. government really initiated Mexican labor migration to the United States. Later on in the 1930s, there will be a repatriation of Mexicans that doesn't figure very importantly in our U.S. history books, but which took place. In my eyes, in 1942 begins a very important era, the second Bracero era, which will last until 1964. During that time period, about 5 million Mexican workers are admitted to temporary jobs in the United States. At the same time, about 7 million Mexican workers are removed from the United States. There's so much to talk about. I'll just mention in passing something that's largely forgotten today, is that during the first Bracero program, the Mexican government proposed that the United States government adopt what are called employer sanctions. That is to say, laws to penalize illegal employment of aliens, because so many Texas growers were ignoring the terms of the bilateral agreement. So Mexico hoped that employer sanctions would increase compliance with the terms of the bilateral agreement. This became a cause célèbre for progressives in the United States. And in 1952, the two houses of Congress adopted employer sanctions in the bills. But the bills went to a committee, and Lyndon Baines Johnson headed that committee, and he rewrote the law to make sure that employers were not punishable. And so this is called the Texas Proviso to the INA of 1952. And it was not illegal for employers in the United States to hire aliens who were unauthorized to work in the United States until 1986. By the 1970s, there's growing concern over illegal Mexican migration to the United States. We set up a select commission headed by Father Hesburgh of Notre Dame to make recommendations to Congress, and that commission recommends that we, a kind of a carrot and stick approach, that we legalize illegal persons in the United States, but that we create a credible employer sanction regime after the legalization, the carrot and the stick. And amongst the recommendations was that there should be introduced a counterfeit-resistant employment eligibility document. That was recommended by the Select Commission. It was ignored by Congress. There was intense opposition to employer sanctions. We didn't get a law adopted until 1986. That law legalized 3 million aliens, most of whom were Mexicans, but we never got a credible employer sanction regime. It was aborted, really, from the beginning. That was the deal. Congress did not consummate it. Congress did not carry it through, and basically IRCA never had a chance of curbing illegal migration. Shortly thereafter, in my time is up, we would take NAFTA. NAFTA was supposed to be all about curbing illegal migration. Well, it hasn't worked. Okay, it's very clear. The Select Commission, the Second Commission will make recommendations. This will be the Commission on Immigration Reform. They recommend that we build a credible employer sanction regime. Congress totally ignores them. Instead, we see this disastrous approach to building walls along the border. Everybody knew this would take many lives. In 1996, we get another law. Once again, they ignore employer sanctions. There's been no enforcement of employer sanctions to speak of. Instead, there's further enforcement of the wall. And that brings us up to recent memory, that is to say, the honeymoon, the abortive honeymoon of 2001. I simply have no longer the time to go into detail. So I will save maybe some of my concluding remarks and some of my observations about comparisons for later on.
Thank you, Mark. It's a fantastic contextual background for us to sort of set the stage for the rest of the conference. I did want to note, also I failed to note in my introductory comments, we will have a question and answer session following the presentation, so we'd like to encourage a lot of interchange. Michelle, I'll now turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. It's a little intimidating to go after someone whose work is so influential and respected, and whose book I was actually adopted for a course as well. So it's a real honor to be with you here, Mark. He's given us a fabulous overview, and I'd like to hone in on one aspect of the changing context of migration today, and that's what do we do with the people who migrate? How are they treated in the countries where they are hosted? We've got almost 3% of the world's population living in other countries. In places like the United States, about 12% of the population here is foreign-born. About 4% don't have any papers. And so there's actually a quite big part of the population that's got a very, very different status from the established American citizens. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the implications of that for this country, and also about the struggles that other countries are dealing with around the world. Who is a citizen? How do you decide who's a citizen? What's the line between what a citizen has the rights to and that a non-citizen has rights to? And this is actually a huge, huge dilemma around the world. Countries are adopting all sorts of ways of dealing with this question, some of them quite unusual, and it would be very surprising to Americans. Talking about this issue, I often find people say, well, this is what citizenship is about, and that's the way it is. And there's not quite such a consciousness that it's only fairly recently that we've come to this understanding of what citizenship is. And I think in the coming years, it's going to become a bigger and bigger debate around the world. What are the implications of the rules that we set up for citizenship? Just to give a sense of how much these laws change and also how important it is, the League of Nations, during its short life, commissioned 3 huge global studies of the 3 biggest issues of the time, and one of them was nationalities laws. And Harvard Law School was sort of the spearheading this report. And one sentence from this stands out. I think it could be spoken today just as well as in 1929 when this report was published. But they've said, in fact, there seem to be no laws which are more fluid and subject to change than nationality laws. Of course, immigration touches on just about every other issue in society that you can think of, on health, on social services, on education, on social cohesion, on economics. And I think it goes really down to the question of what is a nation, what does nationhood mean, what's the relationship of one nation to other nations. And if we don't look at this question, we're not going to be able to come up with effective policies. To think about this properly, I think we need to go back quite far in time and realize that the concept of citizenship has changed dramatically. The word citizen actually comes from city, the city-state, which was the unit of government at the time that the concept started to come together. And then you have the evolution to empires, where you have movement of large groups of people within empires, and the empires were so vast that it was really within empire movements that were almost even more important until the empires started clashing and the borders started shifting. It wasn't really until the 19th century that our current idea of the nation state came to be important. And not coincidentally, that was about the same time that what we now recognize as a passport came into very, very wide use, although it had sort of passports had been in use for quite some time before that. But as Mark mentioned, originally passports, immigration laws were really much more concerned with keeping people from leaving. I look now at the walls that are going up around the world and think about the wall that dominated so many people's consciousness for so long, the Berlin Wall, that was intended to keep people in instead of out. In fact, shortly after Congress passed the border fence idea for the first time in the first Sensenbrenner bill, I went to Berlin. First thing, coming in from the airport, the taxi driver takes you past the Brandenburg Gate, and first thing he says was, you guys are putting up a wall? We're so proud that we took ours down. And so it's really been very recently that walls have gone up to keep people out. During the 20th century, there was a huge question of how do people give up their old nationality. During the First World War, there was a lot of concern in the United States over the largest minority in states at that time who were technically subjects of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, at which we, of course, were at war. And there was a lot of suspicion against those people, a lot of browbeating, a lot of harassment, and there was a real movement to prove your loyalty to the United States. During the course of the 20th century, the question of dual citizenship was also wrestled with. We think of dual citizenship as a fairly new thing. It was really only in the 1960s that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that yes, this was something that was allowed, particularly in cases when people couldn't give up their old citizenship. The other countries simply wouldn't let it go. Another change that we've seen is that the rights of citizens have expanded greatly. Certainly with the creation of the United States, democracy movements during the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. And also, since the beginning of the 20th century, the services, social services, public education, other things provided by states to the people living with them expanded. And of course, one of the biggest debates about immigration today is involving questions of health care, of education, of social services. Should we be providing these things to immigrants, whether they are legal, illegal, whatever their status is? Should citizens be the only ones to get these services? It brings you to the question of why do we provide these services? Certainly we wouldn't have started them if it wasn't in the country's interest to get them in the first place. And it's a big debate that needs to be resolved. Also, recognizing, as Mark said, the change of migration to the point where about half of migration from the latest study I've seen is actually from one developing country to the other within the global south, as it's called. And a lot of these countries are still in a state where they don't afford the same democratic rights to citizens that other countries do. So there you'll see that the line often between the citizens and non-citizens is not quite so distinct, but it's not because citizens have more rights, it's actually because they have less. I was at a conference in Seville in March, sponsored by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We were talking about Mexico and about the many countries in the world that previously were mainly sending countries and are now receiving countries. And a very distinguished participant from Mexico said, well, you think you treat Mexicans badly in the United States. You should see how we treat Guatemalans and Salvadorians. So the question of the rights of citizens, I think, is also very, very important to the discussion of migration. Also, interestingly, in the mid-19th century, when passports started to be used more widely, which is, of course, with the solidification of the idea of the nation-state, another important change happened. Until the mid-19th century, some countries would actually issue passports to citizens of other countries. France would issue them to people from England and vice versa. And that actually stopped, and the emphasis changed to really working on keeping people out after an assassination attempt perpetuated by someone who come in on a false passport. There's another category in between citizenship and non-citizenship that I think is becoming more and more important, which is denizenship. First reference to this was actually in the early 16th century when England issued what is called the Letter Patent of Denization. And that's basically, I guess, almost the equivalent of today's green card, the legal permanent resident status. Is for foreigners, giving them a certain sort of privileged status that is more than non-citizens, less than citizens. Today, you see with mass migration, large categories of people who are denizens, children who are born abroad to emigres, refugees and asylees, guest workers, other long-term workers. We've seen the expansion of this sort of third category of people who are not going to be allowed to naturalize. They're never going to be allowed to belong completely, yet they're still allowed to be present. How are countries dealing with some of these issues? I thought I'd share with you some of the solutions, some in one direction, some in the other one, around the world, and some of the discussions that are going on. They're very, very similar to some of the discussions we're having in the United States, although with different solutions. Germany, as many of you know, from the 50s on, had a very extensive guest worker program with the idea people would come temporarily and then they would go back, many of them, to Turkey. And from that, people came to understand that there's nothing more permanent than a temporary worker. Germany has been thinking hard about this lately, recently changed their laws to start making it possible for the children of some of these guest workers to become German citizens. They unfortunately found that participation has not been what they would like. In many cases, it's because of very, very practical issues, like whether people want to be able to inherit land in their home country or not, This is a question in the United States for a lot of Latin Americans whose countries have been very aggressive since the early 1990s in offering dual citizenship, in trying to re-engage people who have left. There are questions of when you fly back to your home country, you might be charged a higher entry tax if you are not a citizen of that country. You might not be allowed to invest in a business. You might not be allowed to own land. And so this is actually a practical matter for many people. In the United States, it's the opposite, as this country has talked about restricting the benefits that are offered to legal immigrants. Some people are becoming citizens either out of fear or out of practicality. Certainly, some of the changes in our regime have made people much more vulnerable to mishaps, such as I've heard of people who have been wrongly accused of shoplifting, were told by their attorneys that it was much easier to just plead guilty, get away with a little slap on the fist. It would be much cheaper financially than to fight something, even though people were innocent. People would do that before 1996 when the laws changed, and retroactively we imposed rules that if you're convicted of a crime of a certain level, you are going to be deported. So a lot of people are really becoming citizens out of fear, and we really need to ask ourselves: do we want people to become citizens because they feel like they're Americans, because they're part of the country, or because they're just looking at it as a practical matter? The former colonies, the British Empire, saw some of their citizens' rights revoked, sort of from the 60s on, and many of those countries also are seeing emigration, people who go off to the United States, who grow up in a very different culture and want to come back. And they've set up systems to prevent some of those people from coming back, and have set up a very interesting arrangement whereby being a citizen is only an administrative measure. It means the right to carry a British Overseas Territory passport, but you can actually be a citizen. For example, some of these the emigres hold this passport. They're technically citizens, but they're actually not allowed to vote in many places in the English-speaking Caribbean, because to vote you have to be something called a belonger, and that's more like what most of us think of as a citizen. With dual citizenship, you're seeing a lot of very interesting new forms of political participation. A lot of my original work was in the Dominican Republic, and when I went down to cover some of the elections as a journalist, I would go down to the hotel, to the breakfast buffet in the morning, and sit down next to people who I knew from New York City, as state assemblymen, city council members. Half of New York City was down there, and interestingly, it was the people who were most involved in civil society and political participation in New York City who were also most involved in the political life in the countries of origin. I interviewed a sitting city council member in Hackensack, New Jersey, who was Colombian. And Colombia fairly recently established a seat in its Senate that was reserved for people from the diaspora population. And so he actually made a lot of news by running for that seat while he was a sitting council member in New Jersey. Although when I talked to him about it, he says, I never would have done it if I had any idea that I might have won, which of course he didn't. He said, I just was shocked that so few other Colombians stood up and wanted to run for that office, so I did it really to shame them into participating. It would have been a very big surprise if he had won, but this raises a lot of issues for dual citizens who might hold office in other countries. A lot of implications for allegiance, loyalties, if there's any sort of conflict of interest between the two countries. A lot of emigres from the United States to the United States have returned to their countries of origin and held very important political offices. The Lithuanian president in 1997 was actually a former United States government official. overseas absentee voting, which is something that Americans have taken for granted for a very, very long time, is quite new in a lot of countries. Dominican Republic, Mexico, Ecuador, the Philippines have only recently begun to allow it. Some countries have gone even further. Colombia, as I mentioned, and Cape Verde reserve seats in their national legislatures for dual citizens. In 2006, Italians who were living abroad elected 12 deputies and 6 senators who were their offices were specifically created to represent areas of the world that were outside of Italy. At the same time, there's a question of how do you make someone become a citizen? You're seeing many more countries, particularly in the last few years, adopting citizenship tests, much like the United States has had for a long time. Interestingly, you read a lot about the new citizenship test in this country. That's been quite controversial because of its change in concept. Some people think it's going to be more difficult than the previous tests. If you look at the evolution of the test, it's very interesting. At the very beginning, it was all the regional immigration officials who were allowed to decide, often with a little palm greasing or other irregular measures, who was allowed to come in and naturalize. So to prevent that, a set of questions were instituted in a lot of these places. And in the 80s, Washington pulled all these questions together into a big batch, the 100 questions, some of which were quite ridiculous. One of them was, what form did you fill out in order to apply for naturalization? Which I thought was an amazing judge of your ability and your commitment to the United States and your suitability as the United States citizen. My understanding was that was put in there to make it easy. It's sort of a judge of English. And some of them were trick questions, actually. I'd ask all my academic friends, what were the original 13 states? And everyone was like, Massachusetts, I don't know. Turns out the answer was simply the 13 colonies, which no one who I knew, no Americans actually got. But there's a lot of debate. UK has a new test. They're actually talking about applying the test to legal permanent residents as well. Even for legal permanent residents, you're seeing many, many more rules. 6 biggest European nations recently decided to create an integration contract. So if you want to come and become a legal permanent resident or their equivalent of it, you've got to sign this. Things also go both directions. Algeria recently granted the right to birthright citizenship to children who were born of Moroccan women who married foreigners. Those children previously did not have the right to citizenship. Across Europe, also across the United States, there's been an increase in discussion of, and in many cases, the granting of rights to non-citizens to vote. In the United States, that's mainly in local elections, which to me is an interesting way of bringing things full circle back to the idea of the city-state, the idea being, a citizen is a member of a political body, and a lot of the municipalities that are discussing this say, look, by renting a place, by owning a place in this town, you're a member of this city as a political body, very separate from national citizenship, and it's actually in our interest to extend rights to these people because it gives them a stake in our communities. It gives them a reason to be involved in trying to better the community for everyone. And that really goes back to the question of the citizenship rights that are afforded, the line between citizens and non-citizens. How do you encourage people to become citizens? How do you not make it so easy to be a non-citizen that there's no incentive to become a citizen? But at the same time, how do you come up with the ideal set of policies so that everyone who's living in your country, particularly when you have 12% or there's some countries with 30% or more foreign-born, how do you ensure that they participate and have a stake in getting things better? On the other end, there have been lots of efforts to revoke citizenship, particularly in the case of high-profile immigrants. in the Netherlands, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. In the Dominican Republic, Sonia Pierre, who's an activist for the rights of Haitian migrant workers. There were both efforts recently to revoke their citizenship. In very weak states, and this going back to the question of the rights that are afforded to citizens versus those of non-citizens, particularly in Africa, in very troubled places like Côte d'Ivoire, Democratic Republic of Congo, you see efforts to try to deny the citizenship of people whose families have been there for generations but are members of ethnic nationalities. You also have cases like France, something that was very much commented on after the riots a couple years ago in Paris, was that many of the people who rioted were actually citizens on paper, second-generation citizens, but they weren't actually putting citizenship into practice. In this country, you're starting to see more and more accusations, particularly against Latinos, naturalized and otherwise, that they are not citizens. There was a judge, an elected judge in New Mexico recently who was accused very publicly of not being a citizen, even though she was. So it's becoming a weapon to attack people who are very much legitimate citizens of their countries. So going forward, I think that there are a lot of questions that certainly in the United States we need to look at, and certainly in other countries we need to look at. How do we determine citizenship? Who has the right to it? There's been a long time struggle between mainly birthright blood citizenship, which is what Germany had until it modified it recently. There's certainly been some talk in the United States about denying birthright citizenship, particularly to the children of unauthorized immigrants. Or should it be the place of birth? Should you be a citizen of the place that you were born? This is a very important question, but there are a lot of people who, if soil, the right of citizenship by soil is taken away, there are a lot of people who may not actually be eligible for citizenship anywhere and end up being stateless. Also, what do we do with this third category that has really been prevalent since the middle of the 20th century? Depending on where you are in the political spectrum, you're going to have a different word for it. Illegal, undocumented. Somebody pointed out to me that people who are here without papers, or they're not actually necessarily without papers, they're not undocumented. They've got more documents than any of you or I do. So someone proposed fraudulently documented. The United Nations suggests irregular, which suggests to me something you need Imodium for. So I don't think that's a great word. I think unauthorized is what I tend to use, trying to find something that's not so politically charged for either side. In fact, in a lot of talking about migration, I think we could do well to come up with an entirely new set of words. Some people you say assimilation, people go, oh, you can't say that. Sometimes you say multiculturalism. The other side says, no, you can't say that. I tend to use the word pluralism instead, hoping that that's something that the left and the right can both actually have a conversation on it. There's the question of how does one earn the right to become a citizen or even to legalize. Giving a talk recently in Chicago, I had a question from the audience saying, look at all these people who are here illegally. How do we get them to go home? And I said, well, is that really the question that you want to ask? The question that you ask is who do we want to be part of our communities? What are the criteria? If you have someone who has been an active part of the community, contributing, upstanding, trying to make things better, isn't that the criterion that you really want to use for whether somebody should be here legally or not, or a citizen or whatever? I think our real criteria for citizenship need to reflect back on citizenship by Americans. You look at voter participation rates in this country, which are dismal. Interestingly, in the 19th century, when more non-citizens were allowed to participate, were encouraged to participate more, voter turnout was 75-80%. Now you have, we're thrilled if we get up to 60% in a national election. Local elections, you'll get, the 20 to 30%, which is really quite quite sad. You probably saw the recent study by Robert Putnam and his on diversity, suggesting on the one hand that as more new people come into a community, that participation drops. Interestingly, something that didn't get reported as much, although he was quoted on it a number of times, was that as time goes by, this difference erodes, suggesting that people do find a way to incorporate newcomers to their community. But his previous work certainly focused on how Americans are bowling alone, how there's much less community participation, and that's a real issue I think we've got to resolve for native-born citizens if we're going to properly address how we want to deal with newcomers. What are the practical impacts of some of these citizenship policies? As I mentioned, are citizenship policies encouraging people to naturalize? Are they discouraging them? Are our legal systems set up to encourage this sort of third class of people? And what are the implications of that? Certainly a lot of the labor groups have been very much opposed to guest worker programs that don't provide a path to citizenship for precisely this reason, that would create a marginalized population. At the same time, the question of rule of law is very important to Americans. So how do we come up with a system that respects the rule of law and also encourages everyone who's in this country to participate in making it a better place? And finally, does participation in someone's country of origin help or hinder their loyalty to their country of origin? Is a passport a piece of paper? Is citizenship something that's merely a bureaucratic issue, or is it something emotional? I would suggest that by making a commitment to live in a new country, I think people speak very, very clearly about where their loyalty is. What is loyalty? If you come from a country that's a dictatorship, you can be certainly loyal to your country, but not to the policies of the government of that country. So it's a very, very big difference. There's a wonderful book called Citizens in Waiting by Hiroshi Motomura that talks about immigration policy. In the past, immigrants were assumed to come, they were citizens in waiting, so all the policies were designed to draw them into society so that they would eventually become citizens. I think we've moved in an opposite direction recently and need to take a very good hard look at our role in that, not just blaming immigrants for their status, for their naturalization, for their learning English or not, but look at the policies we have that determine whether people are going to learn English or not, whether they are going to naturalize or not, and are those results what we want. And finally, going back to this question of nationality, there's a lot of talk about immigration focused on the U.S. borders and within this country. But I think if you want to look at the bigger picture of who comes in, what drives migration, you've got to look at the countries of origin as well. I speak a lot on MSNBC, and in a debate some months ago with Jim Gilchrist over the wall, I said, look, we're going to spend $50 billion on a wall when we could use that money towards healthcare in the U.S., towards teachers, towards an employer verification system that could also be used to go after the bad apple employers who use immigration laws as a way to give them sort of license to abuse labor laws. And we could put some of that money towards development in Mexico, to some of the towns that don't have proper education, that don't have sewage system, that don't have roads to get their goods to market. We could actually invest some of that money in things that would do a lot more to prevent people from walking across the desert than just building a wall would. And to my great surprise, Jim Gilchrist of the Minutemen came up and said, you know what, I agree with you. I think there should be a Mexican dream, just like there is an American dream. I think many Mexicans would probably disagree with the idea that there's not a Mexican dream. But I think the fact that the two people on very different sides of the debate could agree on something like this is very important. And I also think that if you're going to do this, it also shouldn't be a United States goes and tells Mexico what to do. It's a question of sitting down with Mexico, saying what are our shared interests, where's the interdependence here, and how can we come up with a win-win solution for everybody. And in that sense, the question of nationality becomes one of yes, how do you define your border, but also how do you define yourself in relation to cooperation with your neighbor. So I'm afraid I've left you with a lot more questions than answers. I'm working on a big project this year on some of these questions, studying some of the citizenship practices around the world that might be unusual to some of us. So hopefully, and particularly with a lot of dialogue, maybe together everyone can start to come up with remotely satisfactory answers to some of these questions.